In a quiet Oregon suburb, 24-year-old Noah Reyes was about to confront a lifetime of control. What started as a routine birthday visit took a shocking turn when he refused to sign over his $2 million inheritance, and his parents beat him with a belt. Noah wasn't your typical prodigal son. For years he'd sacrificed everything to keep the peace, known for putting family first. Fleeing with nothing, he unknowingly stepped into freedom. That moment of defiance would spark a chain of revelations, and the Reyes name, once so respected, would never mean the same again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights above John Smith's cubicle flickered with their usual irregular rhythm, casting intermittent shadows across the stack of insurance claims that had become his world for the past 15 years. At 39, he'd perfected the art of making himself invisible in the beige maze of Phoenix General Insurance, his head down, fingers moving mechanically across the keyboard as he processed yet another denial letter. The envelope arrived at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday in his carefully constructed prison of routine. Martha from the mailroom dropped it on his desk with her usual grunt, and John noticed immediately that it wasn't the typical company correspondence. The thick cream paper bore the letterhead of Whitman and Associates, estate attorneys, and his name was written in elegant script across the front. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, a strange premonition settling in his chest. The words seemed to blur together at first. Regret to inform you of the passing of Rose Elena Smith. And then, further down, numbers that made him blink and reread the paragraph 3 times. $2 million. His grandmother Rose had left him $2 million. The cubicle walls seemed to close in around him as memories flooded back unbidden. Rose's small apartment that always smelled of lavender and oil paints, her weathered hands guiding his 8-year-old fingers as she taught him to mix colors on a palette. "Johnny," she would say in her soft voice, tinged with the faint accent she'd never quite lost, "you see things differently than other people. That's not a burden, Mijo. That's a gift." He remembered the way she would listen, really listen, when he talked about the stories he wanted to tell through his art, the visions that would keep him awake at night with their intensity. She was the only one who never told him to be practical, to think about his future, to stop wasting time on foolish dreams. "Art isn't selfish, Johnny," she had told him during one of their secret afternoon sessions when he was 16, bruises still fresh on his ribs from his father's latest lesson about responsibility. "It's how we make sense of pain, how we transform it into something beautiful." John's throat tightened as he thought about the last time he'd seen her, 3 months ago at the care facility. Even then, her eyes had held that sharp intelligence, that unwavering belief in him that he'd never understood. She'd squeezed his hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Don't let them steal your light, Mijo. Promise me." He'd promised, not understanding then what she meant. The afternoon crawled by in a haze of disbelief. John found himself staring at the letter, reading and rereading the legal language that spelled out his unexpected freedom. $2 million. Enough to quit this soul-crushing job. Enough to go back to school, to study art properly this time. Enough to finally pursue the dreams he'd buried under years of family obligation and his father's disappointed sighs. At 5 o'clock sharp, John grabbed his jacket and headed for his car, the letter clutched in his sweaty palm. He needed to see Rose's house one more time before he called his parents. He needed to understand what this meant, what she'd intended. The drive to her neighborhood took him through parts of Phoenix he rarely visited anymore. The tree-lined streets where modest homes sat behind well-tended gardens, where the American dream felt more attainable than it did in his sterile apartment complex. Rose's house looked smaller than he remembered, the desert landscaping she'd been so proud of now slightly overgrown. The key was where she'd always kept it, under the painted rock shaped like a cactus flower. Inside, the house felt hollow, most of her furniture already removed by the estate company. But in what had been her art room, John found something that made his knees weak. Scattered across an old wooden table were sketches, dozens of them, his sketches, drawings he'd done as a child and thought were long lost. She'd kept every single one, From his crude crayon attempts at age 5 to the more sophisticated charcoal studies he'd shown her in high school, beneath them was a manila folder labeled Johnny's Talent in her careful handwriting. Inside the folder were photocopies of art school applications, scholarship information, even printouts of successful artists who'd started late in life. At the bottom was a handwritten note. For when you're ready to stop hiding from yourself. John sank into the folding chair beside the table, tears blurring his vision. She'd known. Somehow she'd known this day would come. Known that he would need not just the money, but the reminder of who he'd once dreamed of becoming. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "Haven't heard from you this week. Everything okay?" The guilt hit him like a physical blow. His parents. Emma. They had no idea about the inheritance yet, and already he could imagine their reaction. His father's immediate calculations. His mother's quiet but insistent pressure. Emma's fragile smile as she explained her latest medical bills or business failure. John stepped outside onto Rose's small patio, the desert air warm against his face, and dialed his parents' number. "John?" His mother's voice carried that particular tone she used when she was trying too hard to sound cheerful. "I was just thinking about you. How's work? Mom, I need to tell you something." He took a deep breath. "Grandma Rose, she left me some money. In her will." The silence stretched long enough that John wondered if the call had dropped. Then his father's voice came on the line. His mother had put him on speaker. "How much money, son?" John closed his eyes. $2 million. Another silence, shorter this time, filled with the sound of his parents' rapid whispered conversation. "Well," his father said finally, his voice carefully controlled. That's wonderful news, John. Very generous of your grandmother. When can you come by? We should discuss this as a family." There it was. The shift from surprise to calculation, the immediate assumption that this windfall belonged not to John, but to all of them. He'd heard that tone before, countless times throughout his childhood, when money was tight and sacrifices needed to be made, sacrifices that somehow always fell to him. "I'll come by tomorrow evening," John said, already dreading the conversation. "Good. Emma will want to be here too. She's been having a rough time lately with the business, and you know how her medical expenses are piling up again." After he hung up, John sat in Rose's garden as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him of the watercolors he used to love. His phone rang again. Emma this time. "Johnny." Her voice had that breathless quality that meant she was either excited or in crisis. "Mom told me about Grandma Rose. I'm so sorry for your loss, but also, wow, $2 million? That's like winning the lottery." "It is a lot of money," John agreed carefully. "I keep thinking about what this could mean for all of us. I mean, I know it's yours, but family looks out for family, right? And honestly, the timing couldn't be better. The wellness center I invested in? It's going under, and the lawyers are saying I might be personally liable for some of the debts. Plus, Dr. Wright wants to try this new treatment protocol, but insurance won't cover it." John listened to his sister's familiar litany of financial woes, feeling the weight of expectations settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Emma wasn't malicious. She never was. She genuinely believed that her needs should take precedence, that family resources should flow naturally toward her most pressing crises. "We'll figure something out," he said, the words automatic after years of practice. "I knew you'd understand. You always do. That's why you're the best big brother in the world." After Emma hung up, John remained in Rose's garden until full darkness fell. The inheritance letter crinkled in his pocket as he finally stood to leave, and he found himself thinking about the note Rose had left with his old drawings. "For when you're ready to stop hiding from yourself." The drive home took him past the Phoenix Art Institute, its modern glass building lit up against the night sky. Through the windows, he could see students working late in the studios, bent over canvases and sculptures, pursuing their passion with the single-minded intensity he remembered from his own youth. $2 million. Enough to change everything. Enough to finally become the person Rose had always believed he could be. But as he pulled into his apartment complex and saw the message light blinking on his answering machine, Undoubtedly more calls from family members who'd heard the news. John felt the familiar weight of obligations settling back around him like chains. Tomorrow he would sit in his childhood home and face the collective expectations of his family. He would see his father's desperate eyes and his mother's careful smile, Emma's fragile hope and their united assumption that his windfall was their salvation. And he would have to decide, once and for all, whether Rose's gift was meant to save him or all of them. The apartment felt smaller than ever as John locked the door behind him. Rose's letter still clutched in his hand like a lifeline to a future he wasn't sure he had the courage to claim. Marcus's hand trembled as John turned his key in the front door of his childhood home, the familiar creak of hinges announcing his arrival like a death knell. The house smelled the same, his mother's vanilla candles masking the underlying scent of disappointment and broken dreams that had permeated these walls for decades. "Johnny's here," Emma called from the living room, her voice carrying that forced brightness that meant she was putting on a performance. John stepped into the room and immediately understood he'd walked into an ambush. The coffee table had been cleared of its usual clutter and now displayed a neat array of documents, spreadsheets, medical bills, bank statements, and legal papers arranged with military precision. His father sat behind this fortress of financial desperation like a general preparing for war, while his mother perched on the edge of the couch, her hands twisted in her lap. Emma lay stretched across the recliner, an oxygen tank beside her chair that John didn't remember from his last visit. She looked pale, fragile, her dark circles more pronounced than usual. The sight of her triggered his protective instincts just as it was meant to. "Sit down, son." David's voice carried the weight of authority John had learned to fear as a child. "Your mother made coffee." John remained standing, a small act of defiance that made his father's jaw tighten. "I can't stay long. I have work tomorrow. Actually, that's something we need to discuss." David lifted the first document from his carefully arranged display. "I've run some numbers, and I think you need to understand the full scope of our family situation." Linda rose without a word and returned with a steaming mug, pressing it into John's hands with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You look tired, honey." "You work too hard." The manipulation was so practiced, so seamless, that John almost admired its efficiency. The fragile sister, the concerned mother, the authoritative father with his props and presentations. He'd seen this show countless times, though never with stakes quite this high. "Emma's medical expenses alone are running us about $12,000 a month," David began, his voice taking on the lecturing tone John remembered from childhood punishments. The new treatment Dr. Wright recommended could run another $50,000 over the next year. Add to that the loan we took out for her wellness center investment. "Dad, please," Emma interrupted softly. John doesn't need to hear all the details. But David was just getting started. He spread out bank statements like cards in a poker game, each one revealing deeper levels of debt. "The restaurant's been closed for 2 years now, but we're still paying off the equipment loans. The house has been refinanced twice. Your mother's been working double shifts at the hospital just to keep us afloat." John's gaze found his mother, noticing for the first time how exhausted she looked, how her uniform hung loose on her diminished frame. The guilt hit him like a physical blow, exactly as intended. "We're not asking for charity," David continued, his voice softening into what John recognized as his most dangerous tone. "This is family. We raised you, fed you, put a roof over your head when you were too busy with your art projects to think about practical matters." The words hung in the air like smoke from an old fire, acrid and choking. John felt himself transported back to 17, standing in this same room while his father explained why art school was a selfish waste of money, how real men took care of their families instead of chasing foolish dreams. "Rose's gift is a blessing for all of us," Linda said quietly. "She would have wanted you to help your family. She knew how much Emma means to you." Emma shifted in her chair, making her breathing apparatus more visible. "I hate that this is even a conversation. The last thing I want is to be a burden. If there was any other way..." Her voice trailed off, leaving the implication hanging. There was no other way. There was only John, and his unexpected windfall, and the moral weight of letting his family drown while he pursued selfish dreams. What exactly are you asking for? John's voice came out steadier than he felt. David shuffled through his papers with practiced efficiency. I've done the math. If we pay off the house, settle Emma's medical debts, cover the wellness center liability, and set aside enough for her ongoing treatment, we're looking at about $8 million. That still leaves you with $200,000, more money than you've ever had. The calculation was so precise, so thoroughly researched, that John realized this presentation had been prepared long before he'd even received the inheritance letter. They'd been planning this moment, choreographing it down to Emma's strategic placement and his mother's carefully timed coffee service. $200,000 is more than enough to go back to school part-time, Linda added helpfully. You could take evening classes, pursue your art as a hobby. Isn't that what you've always wanted? A hobby. His life's passion reduced to something he might dabble in during his spare time, after his real obligation, supporting his family, had been fulfilled. John set down his untouched coffee, the cup rattling against the saucer with the tremor in his hands. I need to think about this. What's to think about? David's voice sharpened, the reasonable facade beginning to crack. This is your family, John. Your sister is sick. Your mother is killing herself working double shifts. And you're going to think about it? The room fell silent, except for the soft hiss of Emma's oxygen tank. John could feel their collective expectation pressing against him like a physical weight. 3 pairs of eyes boring into him with the moral certainty that family came first, that his dreams were secondary to their needs, that Rose's gift of freedom was really just another chain binding him to their dysfunction. I said I need to think about it. John moved toward the door, desperation driving him to escape before the walls closed in completely. His father's voice followed him, cold with the promise of consequences. Don't take too long, son. Some decisions can't be undone. The front door slammed behind him with a finality that echoed through the suburban night. But John could still feel their presence, their need, their absolute certainty that he would do what he'd always done, sacrifice himself on the altar of family obligation. His phone was already buzzing with text messages before he reached his car. John's phone buzzed incessantly as he sat in his car outside his parents' house, the screen lighting up with messages that felt like digital shackles. Emma, please don't be mad at Dad, he's just scared. His mother, come back inside, honey, we can work this out. And then his father, stop being selfish. Your family needs you. That last message made something snap inside John's chest. Selfish. The word that had defined his childhood, the weapon his father wielded whenever John dared to want something for himself. Art supplies were selfish. Dreaming of college was selfish. Wanting his parents' approval without having to earn it through sacrifice was selfish. He turned off the phone and drove home through the desert night, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. But sleep wouldn't come, and by morning, the missed calls had multiplied into a digital avalanche of guilt and demand. At work, John stared at his computer screen without seeing it, Rose's letter burning in his pocket like a talisman. Around noon, his supervisor stopped by his cubicle. Smith? You feeling all right? You look like hell. John managed a weak smile. Just tired. Well, snap out of it. These claims won't process themselves. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sitting in this beige prison, denying other people's insurance claims while his family demanded he deny himself. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous tune, and John realized he couldn't spend another day here. Not now. Not knowing that freedom was possible. He called in sick for the rest of the week. By Thursday evening, the pressure had become unbearable. His phone never stopped ringing. Emma had been admitted to the hospital, a convenient emergency that his mother described in breathless, panicked voicemails. His father's messages grew increasingly aggressive. Your sister is fighting for her life, and you're hiding. What kind of man are you? John found himself standing outside his childhood home again, drawn by guilt and 25 years of conditioning. This time, he didn't knock. The argument started the moment he walked through the door. His father was waiting in the living room, pacing like a caged animal, while his mother sat on the couch with red-rimmed eyes. 3 days, David snarled. 3 days we've been trying to reach you while your sister lies in a hospital bed. You were what, too busy counting your money to care about your family? The accusation hit like a physical blow. John felt the familiar shrinking sensation, the way his body automatically prepared for his father's rage. But something was different this time. Maybe it was Rose's voice echoing in his memory. Or maybe it was just that he'd finally reached his limit. I'm not giving you the money. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that seemed to reverberate off the walls. His mother gasped. His father's face went through a series of color changes. Red to white to purple. What did you say? I said no. John's voice grew stronger. I'm keeping the inheritance. I'm going to art school. I'm going to live my own life for once. David moved across the room with a speed that belied his 58 years, his hand connecting with John's cheek in a slap that echoed through the house. Ungrateful bastard. After everything we've done for you. Done for me? The sting of the slap cleared John's head, cut through years of conditioning and fear. Like what? Like beating me every time I disappointed you? Like destroying every drawing I ever made? Like telling me I was worthless unless I was useful to you? We gave you everything! David's voice cracked with rage. Food, shelter, education. You gave me what parents are supposed to give their children? That doesn't make me your property. The second blow was harder, a closed fist that sent John stumbling backward. His mother cried out but made no move to intervene, the same passive response she'd shown throughout his childhood. David, please. Linda's voice was weak, ineffectual. Shut up! David turned back to John, his eyes wild with desperation and fury. You think you can just abandon your family? Walk away from your responsibilities? He grabbed John by the shirt, dragging him toward the hallway closet where he kept his belt. The same leather strap that had marked John's childhood with welts and bruises. The instrument of correction that was supposed to teach him respect and responsibility. You're 39 years old, John said, his voice eerily calm, and you're going to beat me with a belt. You're my son, you'll always be my son. And sons obey their fathers. The belt whistled through the air, connecting with John's ribs through his thin shirt. The pain was sharp, immediate, but not as devastating as the realization that nothing had changed. He was still that frightened 8-year-old boy, still the family scapegoat, still the one who had to bleed so others could feel whole. The second lash caught him across the back. The third wrapped around his shoulder. With each blow, John felt something inside him dying, not his spirit, but his last vestige of hope that these people could ever love him without conditions. Stop it! Dad, stop! Emma's voice cut through the violence like a knife. She stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on her walker, her face white, with shock and horror. You're beating him, she whispered. Oh, God, you're actually beating him. David froze, the belt raised for another strike, caught between his rage and his daughter's devastating clarity. This is what you've been doing all these years, isn't it? Emma's voice broke. When I wasn't here, when I was at treatments, you've been beating my brother. The room fell silent except for John's ragged breathing and his mother's quiet sobs. Emma's eyes met his across the chaos, and for the first time in their lives, she really saw him, not as the strong big brother who could shoulder any burden, but as the broken man their father had created through decades of systematic abuse. I'm calling the police, Emma said, reaching for her phone. No. John straightened slowly, blood seeping through his shirt. I'm leaving, and I'm never coming back. He walked past his father, past his sobbing mother, past his sister who was finally seeing the truth. At the door, he turned back once. The money stays with me. All of it. And if any of you try to contact me again, I'll press charges for assault. The desert air hit his face like freedom itself as John stumbled to his car, his body screaming with pain, but his mind clearer than it had been in years. Behind him, his family's voices rose in desperate argument, but their words no longer had the power to touch him. He drove to the nearest ATM and transferred the inheritance to an account they couldn't access, then sat in his car and finally understood what Rose had meant when she'd made him promise not to let them steal his light. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They'd been stealing it all along, piece by piece, beating it out of him, with belts and guilt, and the twisted logic of family obligation. But Rose had given him something they couldn't take: the power to save himself. His phone buzzed with another message from his father. John turned it off and drove into the night, leaving his old life bleeding on his parents' living room floor. The silence in John's apartment felt different now. Not the oppressive quiet of resignation, but the electric stillness before a storm breaks. His ribs throbbed with each breath, purple bruises already blooming across his torso like twisted flowers, but his mind moved with a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He pulled out the duffel bag he'd used for weekend trips that never happened, filling it with essentials: clothes, toiletries, his old sketchbooks hidden in the back of his closet, the few photographs he couldn't bear to leave behind. Each item felt symbolic, a conscious choice about what version of himself he was taking into his new life. At the bottom of his bedroom closet, beneath years of accumulated guilt and abandoned dreams, John found the small wooden box Rose had given him for his 18th birthday. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that smelled faintly of her lavender perfume, was the envelope he'd never opened, the one she'd pressed into his hands with trembling fingers just months before her death. "For when you're ready to fly, Mijo," she'd whispered, her eyes holding secrets he was only now beginning to understand. The envelope was heavier than expected, thick with more than just paper. John's fingers shook as he broke the wax seal, an old-fashioned touch that was so perfectly Rose. Inside, her familiar handwriting covered several pages in careful script, but it was the other contents that made his breath catch. A new passport with his photograph but a different name, Jonathan Rivers, and a detailed map with an address circled in red ink. "My dearest Johnny," the letter began, and he could hear her voice in every word. "If you're reading this, then the day I've been preparing for has finally arrived. I've watched my son become a man I no longer recognize, watched him turn his pain into cruelty and pass that poison to his children. But you were always different. You had your grandfather's eyes, full of dreams and determination. I couldn't save you from their house, but I could prepare a way out." John sank onto his bed, the letter trembling in his hands, as Rose's words revealed the depth of her understanding, her years of secret preparation. "The address on the map belongs to Marcus Torres, my business partner, and the closest thing to a brother I ever had. He's been waiting for you, Johnny. He has documents, resources, and most importantly, he has instructions I've left for your new beginning. The passport is real. I have connections you never knew about, people who understand that sometimes we must become someone new to survive." Rose's letter continued with practical details that revealed a mind still sharp despite her age. Bank routing numbers for accounts she'd established under his new identity. Contact information for people in different cities who owed her favors. Even suggestions for how to avoid digital tracking in an age where disappearing had become nearly impossible. "I know this seems overwhelming, Mijo, but you've survived their house for 39 years. You're stronger than you know. The money I left you isn't just inheritance. It's ammunition in a war for your soul. Use it wisely. Live the life you were meant to live, not the one they tried to force on you." At the bottom of the envelope was a photograph John had never seen. Rose as a young woman, standing beside a handsome man in front of what looked like an art gallery. On the back, in Rose's younger handwriting, "Miguel and Rose, opening night of my first show, 1962. Dreams don't die, Johnny. They just wait." The revelation hit him like cold water. Rose had been an artist, a successful one, judging by the gallery setting and her confident posture in the photograph. All those afternoons in her apartment, surrounded by paintings he'd assumed were hobbies. And she'd been a professional artist who'd given it all up for family, for his grandfather, for the same obligations that were now trying to claim John. But she'd found a way back to her art, and now she was offering him the same chance. John moved with purpose now, his earlier hesitation burned away by Rose's carefully laid plans. He called his bank and transferred funds to the accounts she'd specified, watching his old identity's resources drain away like water from a broken dam. Next, he canceled his lease, his insurance, his utility accounts, methodically erasing John Smith from the administrative record of his existence. The hardest part was his job. John sat in his car outside Phoenix General Insurance, staring at the building where he'd spent 15 years of his life processing other people's claims for security and peace of mind. He'd never felt secure there, never found peace, but it had been familiar, safe in its misery. He called his supervisor from the parking lot. "Reynolds here. It's John Smith. I'm resigning, effective immediately." A pause. "Smith? You can't just... We need 2 weeks' notice, paperwork." "No," John said, surprised by the strength in his own voice. "I don't need anything from you, and you don't get anything more from me. Mail my final check to my apartment. I won't be there to receive it, but someone will forward it eventually." He hung up before Reynolds could respond, then turned off his phone for the last time. John Smith's phone, with John Smith's contacts, and John Smith's history of capitulation and compromise. At a gas station on the outskirts of Phoenix, John bought a burner phone with cash and programmed in only one number, the one Rose had provided for Marcus Torres. The rest of his contacts, his entire digital life, disappeared into the desert night like heat mirages. The used car lot Rose had recommended in her letter was exactly where she'd said it would be, run by a man named Carlos, who asked no questions when John paid cash for a reliable Honda Civic. The transaction took 20 minutes, no paperwork beyond the basics, and suddenly John was driving west toward an address he'd never seen, leaving behind the only life he'd ever known. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, disappearing into darkness that felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. In his rearview mirror, Phoenix's lights grew smaller until they were just another constellation in the desert sky, no more significant than any other distant star. For the first time in decades, John Smith was no one and nowhere, which meant he could become anyone and go anywhere. The bruises on his ribs throbbed with each breath, but they were proof of his survival, not his defeat. Rose's voice seemed to whisper from the passenger seat. "Fly me, Joe." Finally, fly. Marcus Torres's office sat like a hidden gem in downtown Tucson, its understated elegance, a stark contrast to the strip malls and concrete that dominated the city's newer districts. John parked the Honda across the street, his hands still trembling from the 3-hour drive and the weight of what he'd left behind. The building was older, maybe 1950s, with the kind of architectural details that spoke of a time when businesses were built to last rather than maximize profit. The brass nameplate beside the door read Torres and Associates, Investment Management, but it was the smaller sign underneath that made John's breath catch. By appointment only, estate planning our specialty. Rose had planned even this detail, ensuring he would find Marcus at a time when they could speak privately. The elevator carried him to the 3rd floor in mechanical silence, each floor marking another step away from his old life. When the doors opened, John found himself facing a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. "You must be Jonathan," she said, using the name from his new passport without hesitation. "I'm Patricia, Mr. Torres's assistant. He's been expecting you." She led him down a hallway lined with photographs. Not the usual corporate headshots and awards, but images of landscapes, families, moments of genuine joy. At the end of the hall, double doors opened into an office that felt more like a comfortable living room than a place of business. Marcus Torres rose from behind a mahogany desk that had clearly seen decades of use, its surface worn smooth by countless meetings and decisions. He was shorter than John had expected, maybe 65, with silver hair and the kind of face that had earned its lines through laughter, rather than worry. But it was his eyes that struck John most. They held the same warmth, the same unwavering strength that Rose's had possessed. "Johnny." Marcus's voice carried a slight accent, similar to Rose's but deeper, weathered by years of careful conversation. Your grandmother told me so much about you. I feel like I've been waiting 30 years for this meeting. He moved around the desk with surprising agility, embracing John in a bear hug that was both foreign and desperately needed. When was the last time someone had hugged him without wanting something in return? Sit, please. Marcus gestured to a leather chair that looked like it had been designed for actual comfort rather than corporate intimidation. Can Patricia bring you coffee? Food? You look like you've been driving all night. Coffee would be good? John's voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by the emotional toll of the past week. As Patricia disappeared to prepare refreshments, Marcus settled into the chair across from John, creating an intimate conversation space rather than maintaining the power dynamic of a traditional office setup. Rose left very specific instructions, Marcus began, his tone gentle but businesslike. She was quite convinced that this day would come, though I confess I hoped her son might surprise us both. He opened a file cabinet behind his desk and withdrew a thick folder labeled J. Smith Contingency Plan. The sight of it, the careful preparation, the years of foresight, made John's throat tight with emotion. She started this file in 2018, Marcus continued, settling back into his chair, right after she moved into the care facility. She said watching David handle her affairs during the transition convinced her that she needed to protect you more actively. The folder contained photographs, dozens of them. John stared in shock at images he'd never seen. Pictures of himself as a child, teenagers, young adult, all bearing the telltale signs of his father's abuse. A split lip at age 12. Bruises on his arms at 15. The careful way he held himself at 18, protecting ribs that were likely cracked. She took these. John's voice was barely a whisper. During family visits, holidays, any time she could manage it without being obvious. She documented everything, Johnny. Every injury, every sign of what was happening to you. Marcus opened another section of the file, revealing handwritten notes in Rose's careful script. Dates, observations, even transcripts of conversations she'd overheard between John and his parents. December 15th, 2019. Johnny called to cancel Christmas visit. Says he has flu, but I can hear the pain in his voice when he speaks. David got angry about something again. March 3rd, 2020. Saw Johnny at grocery store. New bruise on left temple, carefully concealed with makeup. When I asked about it, he said he fell. Same lie he's been telling since he was 8. The clinical documentation of his abuse was devastating and liberating in equal measure. For the first time in his life, John had proof that what he'd experienced was real, witnessed, documented by someone who loved him. Why didn't she ever say anything? John asked. Why didn't she try to stop it? Marcus's expression grew pained. She tried, early on, when you were small, but David threatened to cut off all contact, and she realized that losing her connection to you entirely would help no one. So she chose a different strategy. She chose to prepare. He opened the final section of the folder, revealing financial documents, legal papers, and what looked like a comprehensive escape plan. The inheritance was just the beginning, Johnny. She's been moving money into accounts under your new identity for years, building a network of people who could help you transition. She even researched art schools, found you mentors, identified cities where you could start fresh without your father's influence reaching you. Patricia returned with coffee and what appeared to be homemade sandwiches, setting them on a small table between the chairs with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood the importance of sustenance during difficult conversations. There's more, Marcus said after Patricia left. Rose arranged for a place where you can stay while you figure out your next steps. She also left detailed letters, one for each month of your first year of freedom. She wanted to guide you through the transition, help you remember who you are beneath all the pain they layered on top. John stared at the folder, overwhelmed by the scope of his grandmother's love and preparation. She'd seen his suffering, documented it, and instead of simply witnessing his destruction, she'd built him a bridge to a different life. She saved me, he whispered. No, Mijo. Marcus's voice carried the same endearment Rose had always used. She gave you the tools to save yourself. But the courage to use them, that came from you. Outside the office windows, Tucson stretched toward mountains that caught the afternoon light like promises. John realized he was no longer running from his old life, but running towards something entirely new. A future Rose had envisioned, but that he would have to build with his own hands. Marcus's directions led John through Tucson's arts district to a converted warehouse that buzzed with creative energy despite the late hour. The building's exterior was unremarkable, weathered brick and industrial windows, but warm light spilled from the studios within, and John could hear the faint sounds of music, conversation, and the kinds of productive chaos that came from artists at work. "Third floor, Studio 3B, Marcus had told him. "Sophia's expecting you." Rose arranged everything. The elevator was a freight lift that groaned and shuddered but carried him upward with determination. When the doors opened, John stepped into a hallway lined with canvases in various stages of completion, sculptures draped in protective cloth, and the rich smell of oil paint and turpentine that transported him instantly to childhood afternoons in Rose's apartment. Studio 3B's door stood slightly ajar, voices drifting out in animated conversation. John knocked softly, his new identity feeling fragile as paper in his pocket while his old wounds still throbbed beneath his clothes. "Come in!" The voice was warm, accented with what sounded like a mix of Spanish and pure Arizona. John pushed open the door and stepped into a space that defied every expectation he'd built about art studios. Instead of the chaotic mess he'd imagined, the room was organized with the precision of someone who understood that creativity flourished within structure. Easels stood at careful intervals, each one holding work that made his breath catch, not because of technical perfection, but because of the raw emotion bleeding through every brushstroke. A woman in her mid-40s looked up from where she'd been discussing a piece with two younger artists. She had silver threading through dark hair that she wore in a practical braid, paint-stained clothes that somehow looked elegant on her compact frame, and eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense to the truth beneath. "You must be Jonathan," she said, using his new name naturally. "I'm Sophia Rivera. Rose told me so much about you." The two younger artists, a man with intricate tattoos covering his arms and a woman with purple hair and multiple piercings, looked up with the kind of friendly curiosity that John realized he hadn't experienced in years. When was the last time someone had looked at him and seen possibility rather than obligation? "Marcus said you have space here," John said, immediately feeling foolish for the obviousness of the statement. "More than space." Sophia wiped her hands on a rag and moved toward him with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in her own skin. "Rose arranged for you to have studio access, materials, and something more important, time to remember who you are when no one's demanding you be someone else." She gestured around the room, and John noticed for the first time that several of the canvases bore the signatures of their creators alongside dates and brief inscriptions. Maria, first painting after leaving, on a vibrant landscape. David, 6 months clean, on an abstract piece that seemed to pulse with newfound energy. Carmen, my truth, written beneath a portrait so honest it was almost painful to look at. "This is a collective," Sophia explained, following his gaze. "We specialize in working with people who are rebuilding their lives. Artists who've survived trauma, addiction, abuse. People who need to learn that their pain can become something beautiful, instead of something that destroys them." John felt something shift in his chest, a recognition so profound it was almost physical. These weren't hobby artists or weekend painters. These were people who understood that art could be survival, that creativity could be the difference between drowning and learning to breathe underwater. "Rose was very specific about what you'd need," Sophia continued, leading him to a corner of the studio where an easel stood ready, basic supplies arranged with careful attention. "She said you'd been drawing since you were small, but that your family made you stop. She wanted you to have everything necessary to start again." Beside the easel was a small table holding sketchbooks, pencils, charcoal, watercolors, and basic acrylics. Not the expensive professional-grade materials John had dreamed of as a teenager, but quality supplies that would let him explore without limitation. Attached to the easel was an envelope with his new name, written in Rose's familiar handwriting. That one's private, Sophia said gently, but she left something else you might want to see. She led him to a wall where a single framed piece hung slightly apart from the others. It was a watercolor landscape. Desert mountains at sunset, painted with the kind of confident brushwork that came from years of practice. At the bottom right corner, in neat script, R. Smith, 1987, for Johnny, who sees with an artist's eyes. She painted that the year you were born, Sophia said softly. She brought it here last month, said it would be waiting when you were ready to see it. John stared at the painting, seeing Rose's artistic skill fully displayed for the first time. The piece was sophisticated, professional quality work that revealed not just technical ability, but a deep understanding of light, color, and composition. She hadn't been a hobbyist. She'd been an artist who'd set aside her calling to raise a family, just as she'd tried to prevent him from doing. She was good, he whispered. She was exceptional, Sophia agreed. And she saw that same gift in you. The purple-haired woman approached with a gentle smile. I'm Carmen. Been here about 8 months now. If you want, I can show you where the good coffee is hidden and explain the unwritten rules. Like how Maria gets territorial about the north-facing easel and why you should never touch David's brushes without asking. The tattooed man looked up from his canvas. David here. Don't listen to Carmen. My brushes are community property. Just clean them when you're done. Their casual inclusion felt surreal. John realized he was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to ask what he could do for them, what obligation he owed, what price his presence would exact. But they simply returned to their work, making space for him in their creative ecosystem without demands or expectations. The studio's open 24 hours, Sophia explained, leading him back to his designated space. Some people work better late at night, others prefer dawn light. We don't have formal classes, but we share techniques, critique each other's work, and generally figure things out together. She handed him a set of keys. These get you into the building and the studio. There's also an apartment upstairs, Studio 4A. It's small but private, and it's yours for as long as you need it. Rose made sure you'd have time to heal before you had to worry about practical matters. John took the keys, their weight solid and real in his palm. For the first time in his adult life, he held the means to enter a space that was his alone, where his presence was wanted rather than merely tolerated. I don't know how to start, he admitted, the honesty surprising him. Sophia smiled, and John saw understanding in her expression. Not pity, but the recognition of someone who had stood in this same uncertain place. The same way you survived everything that brought you here, she said. One moment at a time. Rose left you everything you need except one thing, permission to begin. That has to come from you. John looked at the blank canvas waiting on his easel, then at Rose's painting on the wall, then at the other artists working quietly around him. For 39 years, he'd been told that his dreams were selfish, impractical, secondary to everyone else's needs. But here, in this space Rose had found for him, creation wasn't selfish. It was necessary. He opened the first sketchbook, feeling the clean paper beneath his fingers, and for the first time since childhood, reached for a pencil, without fear of what anyone else might think. The mark he made was tentative, uncertain, but it was his. Detective Sarah Martinez had seen enough missing person cases to recognize the difference between someone who vanished and someone who disappeared. John Smith, she was beginning to suspect, had chosen the latter, and after 3 days of interviews with his family, she was starting to understand why. The call had come in on a Wednesday morning, routed to her desk because domestic situations fell under her purview in the Phoenix PD's Family Crimes Unit. Linda Smith, speaking in the carefully controlled voice of someone trying not to sound hysterical, reported that her son had been missing for a week. He'd stopped answering his phone, hadn't shown up to work, and his apartment manager confirmed he'd abandoned his lease without notice. It's so unlike him, Linda had said during their first interview, dabbing at her eyes with tissues that remained suspiciously dry. Johnny's always been responsible. He would never just leave without telling us. But Sarah had heard that particular tone before, the performance of concern that masked something darker underneath. 20 years on the force, 12 of them specializing in domestic violence cases, had taught her to listen not just to what people said, but to what they carefully avoided saying. The family's story felt rehearsed. David Smith, John's father, sat rigid in the interview room, his answers clipped and defensive. When Sarah asked about their last conversation with John, both parents exchanged a look that lasted just a beat too long. "We had dinner together," David said, "last Thursday. Discussed some family financial matters. Nothing out of the ordinary." "What kind of financial matters?" Another look between the parents. "John recently inherited some money from his grandmother. We were helping him understand his options." Sarah made a note. Inheritance money had a way of bringing out the worst in families, and the Smith parents' body language suggested there was significantly more to this discussion than they were admitting. "How much money are we talking about?" "Does that matter?" David's voice sharpened. "My son is missing. Shouldn't you be out looking for him instead of asking about private family business?" The defensive response confirmed Sarah's suspicions. She'd learned long ago that innocent people answered questions directly, while those with something to hide deflected and accused. "Everything matters when someone disappears, Mr. Smith. The inheritance. Was it a significant amount?" Linda spoke up, her voice carefully modulated. $2 million. "From my mother-in-law's estate. We were trying to help John be responsible with it." Sarah's pen paused on her notepad. $2 million was life-changing money for most people, especially someone working a mundane insurance job. It was also the kind of sum that could drive family tensions to dangerous levels. "And John's reaction to your advice?" "He was confused," Linda said carefully. "Overwhelmed. He needed time to think." "Did he seem upset when he left that night?" Another pause. Another exchanged look. "He was emotional," David admitted. "But John's always been sensitive. Dramatic. He probably went off somewhere to sulk and lost track of time." The dismissive tone made Sarah's jaw tighten. She'd heard too many abusers describe their victims' reactions to trauma as, quote, dramatic, or emotional. It was a way of invalidating legitimate responses to illegitimate treatment. "I'd like to speak with his sister." "Emma, is it?" "She's in the hospital right now," Linda said quickly. Another flare-up of her condition. "She's too sick for interviews." But Sarah had already planned to visit Emma Smith independently. Hospital patients were often more willing to talk when they weren't surrounded by family members managing their responses. That afternoon, Sarah found Emma in a private room at Phoenix General, looking pale but alert. Unlike her parents, Emma's distress seemed genuine. Her hands shook as she described her last phone conversation with John. "He sounded different," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Distant, like he was saying goodbye without actually saying it." "Saying goodbye to what?" Emma's eyes filled with tears. "To us. To everything. I think I finally understand what was happening in our house all these years." The admission hung in the air between them. Sarah leaned forward slightly, recognizing the moment when a witness decided whether to tell the truth or maintain the family's version of events. "What do you think was happening, Emma?" "My parents. My father especially. He was hurting John. Has been hurting him. For years. Maybe decades." The words came out in a rush, as if Emma had been holding them back for too long. "I saw it happen. The night before John disappeared. Dad beat him with a belt, and I just stood there." Sarah's training kicked in, keeping her expression neutral despite the surge of anger in her chest. "Can you tell me exactly what you saw?" Emma's description painted a picture that was all too familiar. An adult child pushed beyond his breaking point, finally standing up to his abuser, and paying a violent price for that moment of defiance. Sarah made careful notes, documenting not just the physical assault, but the emotional manipulation that had preceded it. "Did your parents know you witnessed this?" "Yes, and they know I finally understand what John's been going through. But they're more worried about the money than about finding him." Emma's voice cracked. "They keep talking about how to access his inheritance, how to prove he's mentally incompetent or something. They don't care that he's gone. They care that he took their solution to our financial problems with him. After leaving the hospital, Sarah drove to John's apartment complex. The manager, a weathered woman named Ruth, was more forthcoming than the family had been. Paid his rent for 15 years, never caused trouble, Ruth said, leading Sarah through the abandoned apartment. But the last few months, he looked, like a man carrying too much weight. Then last week, he shows up with cash to break his lease, says he won't be needing the place anymore. Did he seem distressed? Threatened? Ruth considered this. He seemed free, like he'd made a decision he'd been putting off for a long time. Scared, maybe, but not the way someone would be if they were running from danger. More like someone who was finally running toward something. The apartment had been thoroughly cleared, but Sarah found what John's family either didn't know about or had chosen not to mention: a storage unit receipt tucked behind the bedroom radiator. The unit had been paid up for 6 months in advance, suggesting John had planned his departure more carefully than his family realized. At the storage facility, Sarah discovered boxes of childhood artwork, photograph albums, and, most importantly, a manila folder labeled Grandma Rose Private. Inside were letters, documents, and what appeared to be detailed instructions for some kind of contingency plan. One letter, dated just 3 months before Rose Smith's death, made Sarah's blood run cold. My dearest Johnny, if you're reading this, then David has finally pushed you too far and you've had to save yourself. I've been documenting his treatment of you for years, and I've prepared everything you need to start over. Marcus Torres in Tucson has the rest of your inheritance and detailed plans for your new life. Don't let guilt bring you back to people who will never love you the way you deserve to be loved. Sarah photographed every document in the folder, her understanding of the case shifting completely. John Smith wasn't missing. He was escaped, and his grandmother had been planning his rescue for years. Back at the station, Sarah ran John's employment records and financial history. What she found confirmed Emma's suspicions about the family's real priorities. Multiple attempts had been made to access John's inheritance, including inquiries about having him declared mentally incompetent and efforts to freeze his accounts. The picture that emerged was of a family that had spent decades systematically abusing one member while positioning another as the golden child whose needs justified that abuse. Now that their victim had escaped with resources they'd counted on, they were using the police to try to drag him back. Sarah closed her case files and reached for her phone. She had some calls to make, starting with Marcus Torres in Tucson. If John Smith had found his way to safety, the last thing she was going to do was lead his abusers back to him. But if Rose Smith had documented years of abuse, Sarah had a responsibility to ensure that evidence saw the light of day. The Smith family was about to learn that not all investigations went the way they expected. Part 8. The Truth Unveiled. The knock on the studio door came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night, soft but persistent enough to cut through the meditative rhythm of John's painting. He'd been working for 6 hours straight, losing himself in the canvas, the way he'd learned to do over the past 3 weeks at Sophia's Collective. The piece emerging under his brush was raw, honest, a visual representation of freedom that he couldn't have conceived while still trapped in his old life. Jonathan? A woman's voice, unfamiliar but calm. My name is Detective Sarah Martinez. I need to speak with you. John's hand froze mid-brushstroke, paint dripping from his brush onto the studio floor. His first instinct was to run, grab his keys, slip out the back exit, disappear into the Tucson night before whoever had found him could drag him back to Phoenix. But something in the detective's tone stopped him. She'd used his new name, and she'd asked, rather than demanded. He set down his brush and walked to the door, keeping the chain lock engaged as he opened it just wide enough to see into the hallway. Detective Martinez was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and tired eyes that held more understanding than suspicion. I'm not here to arrest you, she said immediately, recognizing his fear. I'm here because I've been investigating your disappearance, and I need you to know what I've found. John studied her face, searching for signs of deception or threat. His years of surviving his father's unpredictable moods had taught him to read people quickly, and everything about Detective Martinez suggested exhaustion rather than aggression. My family sent you. Your family reported you missing, yes, but after investigating their claims, I'm more concerned about what they didn't tell me than what they did. She held up a manila folder, and John's heart nearly stopped. Even from a distance, he could see his grandmother's handwriting on the tab. I found Rose's storage unit, Martinez said gently, and her safety deposit box, and medical records that tell a very different story about your family's financial situation than the one your parents have been sharing. John unhooked the chain and opened the door fully. If she had Rose's files, there was no point in hiding anymore. Martinez stepped into the studio, her eyes taking in the canvases, the evidence of healing creativity, before settling back on John's face. You're not in trouble, she said firmly, but your parents might be. They sat in the small seating area Sophia had created for critiques and difficult conversations, and Martinez opened the folder with the reverence of someone who understood she was handling evidence of both great love and great cruelty. Your grandmother documented 23 years of abuse, Martinez began, her voice professionally steady but warm with empathy. Photographs, medical records she obtained through connections at the hospital where your mother works, even audio recordings from family gatherings where your father's behavior was particularly concerning. She showed John images he'd never seen, pictures Rose had taken during family visits, carefully documenting injuries he'd hidden from everyone else. Transcripts of conversations where David's verbal abuse was laid out in black and white. A timeline that revealed the systematic nature of what John had always been told was normal family discipline. There's more, Martinez continued. Your sister's medical records show significant discrepancies between her actual treatment costs and what your parents claimed to owe. Dr. James Wright, her physician, has been concerned for months about irregularities in billing and insurance claims related to Emma's care. John felt something cold settle in his stomach. What kind of irregularities? The kind that suggest your parents have been inflating Emma's medical expenses and potentially billing for treatments she never received. We're talking about insurance fraud on a significant scale, possibly over several years. Martinez opened another section of the file, revealing financial documents that painted a picture of systematic deception. Your father's gambling debts are real, but they're larger than your family knows. He's been using Emma's medical fund as his personal piggy bank, replacing the money by filing fraudulent insurance claims and charity applications. The revelation hit John like a physical blow. Emma's medical needs, the constant financial crisis that had justified every demand for his sacrifice, every guilt trip about family responsibility, it had all been built on lies. Emma doesn't know. Emma is as much a victim as you are, just in a different way. Your parents have been using her genuine medical condition as cover for their financial crimes, while simultaneously using guilt about her needs to control and manipulate you. Martinez showed him documents that revealed the true scope of his parents' deception. Bank records showing money transferred from Emma's medical accounts to cover David's gambling losses. Insurance claims for treatments Emma had never received. Charity applications that painted a picture of desperate medical need while David was using the donated funds to pay bookies and creditors. The inheritance demand wasn't about helping Emma, Martinez explained. It was about covering up years of embezzlement and fraud before the insurance companies caught on. Your refusal to hand over the money didn't just disappoint them, it threatened to expose their entire operation. John stared at the evidence of his family's crimes, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and grief. He'd been right to leave, but the cost of that knowledge was understanding just how thoroughly he'd been used and manipulated. What happens now? He asked. That depends on what you want to happen. You're the victim of both abuse and attempted financial exploitation. You have grounds for pressing charges on multiple fronts. Martinez leaned forward slightly, her expression serious but kind. But I want you to know that regardless of what you decide about legal action, you're safe. Your parents can't force you to return their money, because it was never theirs to begin with. Rose's will is ironclad, and their attempts to have you declared incompetent have no legal standing. She handed him another document, a restraining order already prepared, requiring only his signature to enforce. This would legally prevent any member of your family from contacting you or attempting to locate you. It's not permanent, but it would give you time to decide what kind of relationship, if any, you want to have with them in the future. John held the paper, feeling its weight. Freedom. Legally documented and enforced. Protection from the people who had spent his entire life convincing him that love came with conditions, that family loyalty required self-sacrifice, that his dreams were less important than their needs. "There's something else," Martinez said softly. "Emma asked me to give you this." She handed him a letter in his sister's handwriting. John opened it with trembling fingers. "Johnny, I'm so sorry. I see it all now. What they did to you, what they used me to do to you. I'm getting help, real help, and I'm getting away from them too. You don't owe me anything, but I hope someday you might forgive me for being blind for so long. I love you. Emma." For the first time since leaving Phoenix, John cried, not from pain or fear, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being seen and understood by the people who mattered. Detective Martinez sat quietly while he processed the magnitude of what she'd revealed, then handed him her card. "Take your time deciding what you want to do about charges. But know this: your grandmother loved you enough to spend years preparing your escape route. Don't waste that gift by looking back." As she prepared to leave, John found his voice. "Thank you for seeing the truth." Martinez paused at the door, her expression serious. The truth was always there. It just took someone who cared enough about you to document it properly. After she left, John sat alone in the studio, surrounded by evidence of both his past trauma and his emerging healing. For the first time in his life, he had legal protection from his abusers, financial security that couldn't be stolen, and most importantly, the truth about what had really been happening to him all these years. He picked up his brush and returned to his painting, adding bold strokes of color that transformed the canvas from something that depicted escape to something that celebrated arrival. 3 weeks after Detective Martinez's visit, John sat in the passenger seat of her unmarked police car, watching his childhood home grow larger through the windshield. The house looked smaller than he remembered, somehow diminished by the legal documents in Martinez's briefcase and the restraining order that gave him the power to leave at any moment. "You sure you want to do this?" Martinez asked, pulling into the driveway behind a black sedan that John recognized as the family lawyer's car. "We could handle everything through attorneys." John touched the thick folder in his lap. Copies of Rose's evidence, financial records of his parents' crimes, and Emma's medical records showing the discrepancies that would likely send his father to prison. "They need to hear it from me. All of it." The front door opened before they could knock. Linda stood in the entrance, her face a mask of carefully controlled hope that cracked the moment she saw Martinez's badge and official bearing. "Johnny, thank God you're—" "Mrs. Smith," Martinez interrupted professionally. "I'm Detective Martinez, Phoenix PD. We're here to discuss the findings of my investigation into your son's disappearance and related financial irregularities." Linda's face went pale. Behind her, David appeared in the hallway, his expression shifting from relief to suspicion as he took in the official nature of the visit. "What's this about?" David demanded, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "John, what have you told them?" "The truth," John said, stepping into the house that had been his prison for so many years. All of it. The living room, where he'd been beaten just a month ago now, felt like a stage set for a play he no longer had to perform in. Emma sat in her usual recliner, but something was different. Her oxygen tank was gone, her color was better, and her eyes held a clarity John hadn't seen in years. The family lawyer, Mr. Harrison, sat stiffly on the couch, his briefcase closed and his expression grim. John realized immediately that his parents had called their attorney not to help find their missing son, but to protect themselves from whatever consequences his disappearance might bring. "Before we begin," Martinez said, settling into the chair across from David, "I need to inform everyone present that this conversation may be recorded, and that anything said here could be used in future legal proceedings." She placed a small recording device on the coffee table, its red light blinking like a truth detector. "John," David's voice took on the wheedling tone he'd always used when he needed something. "Whatever you think happened that night, we can work it out as a family. You don't need to involve the police in private family matters." "Private family matters." John opened his folder and withdrew the first photograph, himself at age 12, with a split lip and black eye. Is this what you call a private family matter? He placed the photo on the coffee table where everyone could see it, then added another, and another. 23 years of documented abuse spread across the surface, like evidence in a courtroom. Linda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Where did you get these? Grandma Rose took them, John said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Every family gathering, every holiday, every time you let Dad beat the hell out of me, she documented it. For 23 years. He pulled out Rose's handwritten notes, reading from them in a voice that grew stronger with each word. December 1995, Johnny, age 16, has finger-shaped bruises on his upper arms. When asked about them, Linda changes the subject. David shows no remorse. That's not, David started. March 2003. Johnny called to cancel Easter visit. Says he has the flu, but I can hear him crying. Linda admits privately that David lost his temper about John's art school applications. John looked up at his parents, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in his adult life. His father's face had gone gray, while his mother sat rigid with the desperate control of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. August 2019. Saw Johnny at grocery store. New bruise on his ribs, visible when he reached for something on a high shelf. He's 38 years old and still covering for his father's violence. Emma spoke for the first time, her voice barely a whisper. Dad, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you weren't still hurting him. David's silence was answer enough. Martinez opened her own folder, withdrawing financial documents that painted an even more damaging picture than the photos. Mr. Smith, these are records from your daughter's medical fund, insurance claims filed in her name, and charity applications submitted on behalf of your family. She spread the papers methodically, building her case with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. Over the past 5 years, you've diverted approximately $180,000 from Emma's legitimate medical fund to cover gambling debts and personal expenses. Emma's sharp intake of breath cut through the room like a blade. What? The treatments Dr. Wright prescribed for you cost approximately $3,000 per month, Martinez continued. But your parents have been billing insurance companies for procedures you never received, filing claims for equipment you don't need, and soliciting charity donations based on fabricated medical expenses. She turned to Emma with the gentle expression she'd shown John during their first meeting. Your parents haven't been protecting you, Emma. They've been using your illness as a cover for insurance fraud. John watched his sister's face crumble as she understood the full scope of their parents' deception. The new treatments Dr. Wright wanted to try? The ones you said insurance wouldn't cover? Insurance would have covered them, Martinez said quietly. But your parents told Dr. Wright that you decided against the treatment because it was too expensive. They were more concerned about maintaining the appearance of financial desperation than about your actual medical care. The room fell silent except for Emma's quiet sobs and the mechanical whir of the recording device. John felt a strange mix of vindication and grief as he watched his family's lies unravel in real time. The inheritance demand wasn't about helping Emma, John said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who finally understood the full picture. It was about covering up your crimes before you got caught. David finally found his voice, but it came out as a broken whisper. We were desperate. The gambling debts, the restaurant failure. We didn't know what else to do. You knew exactly what to do, John replied. The same thing you've done my entire life. Make me pay for your failures. He stood up, feeling the power of his new perspective, literally and figuratively looking down on the people who had spent decades making him feel small. But here's what you didn't count on, John continued. Rose saw everything. She documented everything. And she made sure I had everything I needed to escape your manipulation forever. Martinez stood as well, her professional demeanor returning. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, based on the evidence we've uncovered, you're both being charged with insurance fraud, theft from a medical assistance fund, and filing false charity applications. Mr. Smith, you're also being charged with assault and battery for the attack on your son. She read them their rights with the practiced efficiency of someone who had delivered this speech countless times, while Mr. Harrison frantically took notes and whispered urgent consultations with his clients. John turned to Emma, who sat stunned and sobbing in her chair. "Emma, Detective Martinez found you a new doctor. Someone who will treat your actual condition, instead of the fictional version Dad and Mom have been presenting to insurance companies. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to be part of their lies anymore." Emma looked up at him through her tears. "I'm so sorry, Johnny. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what they were doing to you." "I know," John said gently. "You were a victim too, just in a different way." As Martinez placed handcuffs on his parents, John felt no satisfaction, no sense of revenge fulfilled. Instead, he felt something he'd never experienced in this house: peace. The truth was finally out in the open, documented and official and undeniable. "The restraining order is in effect immediately," Martinez told John as they prepared to leave. "They cannot contact you, approach you, or attempt to access your inheritance funds. You're free." John took one last look around the living room where he'd suffered so much, then walked out the front door of his childhood home for the final time. Behind him, his parents' voices rose in desperate argument with their lawyer, but their words no longer had the power to touch him. Outside, the Arizona sun felt different on his face, warmer, brighter, full of possibility rather than the harsh glare of judgment he'd grown accustomed to. For the first time in 39 years, John Smith was truly free. 6 months later, John stood in the doorway of his new apartment, keys heavy with symbolic weight in his palm. The space was modest, a one-bedroom in a quiet complex 20 miles from his childhood home, but it was entirely his. No shared walls with people who might hurt him, no need to tiptoe through hallways or brace for sudden violence. The inheritance from Rose had covered the security deposit, first year's rent, and enough furniture to start over completely. More importantly, it had paid for Dr. Sarah Chen, the therapist Detective Martinez had recommended, who specialized in adult survivors of family trauma. "It's normal to feel disoriented," Dr. Chen had told him during their first session. "You've spent your entire adult life in survival mode. Learning to exist without that constant hypervigilance is like learning to walk again." She was right. Simple things felt monumentally difficult. Grocery shopping without checking over his shoulder, sleeping through the night without startling awake at every sound, answering his phone without that spike of panic that something terrible was about to happen. But other things were getting easier. He'd started painting again, setting up an easel by the large window that overlooked a small courtyard where children played safely while their parents watched from nearby benches. The first painting he'd completed was abstract, swirls of blue and gold that somehow captured the feeling of breathing freely for the first time. His phone buzzed with the text from Emma. "Doctor appointment went well. New treatment is working. Thank you for everything." The relationship with his sister was slowly healing, built on careful conversations and honest acknowledgments of how their parents' manipulation had affected them both differently. Emma had moved into assisted living, her medical care now properly managed, and her genuine symptoms finally receiving appropriate treatment. The imaginary complications their parents had fabricated were gone, but her real condition required ongoing support. She testified at their parents' trial, her voice shaking but determined as she described the years of manufactured medical crises and fraudulent fundraising. David received 4 years for the financial crimes and an additional 18 months for assault. Linda got 2 years and supervised probation. Both were required to pay full restitution, not just to Emma's medical fund, but to every charity they'd defrauded. John hadn't attended the sentencing. Dr. Chen had helped him understand that he owed them nothing, not his presence, not his forgiveness, not even his anger. They were simply people who had made terrible choices and were now facing the consequences. Detective Martinez had stayed in touch, checking in periodically with updates he didn't always want but somehow needed to hear. The case had been straightforward from a legal perspective. Rose's documentation was so thorough that the defense had little room to maneuver. But Martinez understood that for John, the legal resolution was just the beginning of a much longer process. "Trauma doesn't follow court schedules," she'd told him after the trial ended. Take all the time you need to figure out who you are when you're not just surviving. That question haunted him in the best possible way. Who was John Smith when he wasn't walking on eggshells? When he wasn't absorbing someone else's rage? When he wasn't calculating the safest response to every interaction? He was learning the answer slowly, in small moments of self-discovery. He liked his coffee black but preferred tea in the evenings. He read voraciously, mysteries and science fiction mostly, stories where problems had solutions, and heroes weren't required to sacrifice themselves for unworthy causes. He'd joined a hiking group and discovered that his body, freed from chronic stress, was stronger than he'd ever imagined. Most surprisingly, he'd started volunteering at a crisis center, helping other adults navigate the process of escaping family abuse. The training had been intense, learning to recognize manipulation tactics, understanding trauma responses, developing the skills to offer support without taking on someone else's pain as his own. "You have a gift for this," his supervisor Carol had told him after his first month. "Survivors trust you in a way they don't trust people who learned about abuse from textbooks." The work was difficult, but meaningful. He saw his own story reflected in fragments across dozens of other lives. The daughter whose mother stole her identity to open credit cards, the son whose father had convinced him he was mentally ill to justify years of control and medication, the adult child who'd been made financially responsible for parents who spent every dollar on gambling and blamed their children for their poverty. Each story was different, but the underlying pattern was always the same. People who were supposed to provide love and protection had instead chosen to exploit and harm. And in helping others recognize these patterns, John found his own healing accelerating. Tonight, he was meeting someone new. Sarah, not Dr. Chen, but a different Sarah, whom he'd met at a community art class. She was a middle school teacher, recently divorced, with a laugh that reminded him of wind chimes and a way of looking at his paintings that suggested she saw something in them he didn't even know he'd put there. They'd been talking for weeks, carefully and slowly, about art and books, and the small observations that make up daily life. She knew about his family situation in general terms. Not the specific details, but enough to understand why he sometimes went quiet when conversations turned to childhood memories or family traditions. "I'm not looking to fix anyone," she told him during one of their phone conversations. "I've got my own stuff to work through, but I'd like to get to know you better, if you're interested." The honesty of it had disarmed him completely. No hidden agendas, no manipulation disguised as concern, just a straightforward expression of interest in him as a person, rather than as a project to be managed or a problem to be solved. As he locked his apartment door and headed to meet her for dinner, John caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. The man looking back at him was still learning to stand up straight, still discovering what his face looked like when it wasn't braced for impact. But there was something new there, a quiet confidence, a sense of belonging to himself that he'd never possessed before. His phone rang as he reached his car. For just a moment, the old panic fluttered in his chest, an automatic response to unexpected contact that would probably never completely disappear. But the caller ID showed Dr. Chen's office number, and he answered with the calm certainty of someone who knew he was safe. "John? It's Dr. Chen. I wanted to let you know that your paperwork for the Victims' Compensation Fund was approved. The check should arrive within the week. More money. Enough to continue therapy for another year, to take some art classes, maybe even to travel somewhere he'd never been. But more than the financial security, it was official recognition that what had happened to him mattered, that his pain had been real and documented and worthy of redress. Thank you," he said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "For everything. You did the hard work, John. I just provided the roadmap." As he drove toward the restaurant where Sarah was waiting, John thought about the different kinds of freedom he'd discovered over the past months. There was the legal freedom, the restraining orders and court judgments that kept his parents from contacting him. There was the financial freedom, Rose's inheritance, and the compensation fund that meant he'd never again have to choose between safety and survival. But the most important freedom was something harder to define. The gradual release from the internal prison of learned helplessness, the slow recognition that he had choices and the right to make them, the growing understanding that his life belonged to him and no one else. The sun was setting as he pulled into the parking lot, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded him of the colors he'd been drawn to in his recent paintings. Sarah was waiting by the restaurant entrance, her face lighting up when she saw him in a way that still surprised him with its uncomplicated warmth. "You look happy," she said as he approached. John considered this, testing the accuracy of her observation against his internal state. Happy felt too simple a word for the complex mix of healing and hope, grief and gratitude that made up his daily experience now. But there was something essentially true in what she'd noticed. "I think I am," he said, and meant it. As they walked into the restaurant together, John realized that for the first time in his life he was writing his own story, rather than just surviving someone else's. The ending was still unwritten, full of possibility and choice, and the terrifying freedom of a blank page waiting to be filled. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.